Things in Alaska have always been a little bit different, and their politics are no exception. From the weirdness of several people with the same name running in the same election, to the unnerving power of a few political dynasties, this is an account of the oddities of the Alaska ballot. When Alaskans head to the polls to vote in their nonpartisan August 18th primary, they will find that incumbent Senator Dan Sullivan is facing a challenge from former teacher Dan Sullivan. The confounding presence of Dan J. Sullivan, a long-shot candidate who shares the incumbent's party affiliation, is unlikely to do anything substantial to harm the chances of Dan S. Sullivan, the incumbent senator. Still, it is indicative of a comical pattern of Dan Sullivans in Alaska politics. Another one, Dan A. Sullivan, a former mayor of Anchorage, also appeared on the same ballot as Senator Sullivan back in 2014, though Dan A. was running for lieutenant governor and not senator. But that isn't all. Two relatives with the same surname will also appear on the primary ballot. Eric Hafner, a federal inmate serving a 20-year sentence in New York for threatening various public officials, is running for Alaska's lone House seat. His mother, Carol Hafner, a former waitress and flight attendant, is running alongside the Dan Sullivans for Senate, despite also listing a filing address not in Alaska. How is any of this possible? First, let's examine the odds of there being so many politicians named Dan Sullivan. In 1964, the year Senator Sullivan was born, Daniel was the 11th most popular male name in Alaska and 15th most popular disregarding gender. Moreover, Sullivan is the 94th most common surname in Alaska, comprising 550 people. Thus, how surprising it is to have multiple Dan Sullivans depends on how you look at the data. At face value, given how many Sullivans are in Alaska compared to the state's population, the chance of someone being named Dan Sullivan in Alaska is less than 0.05%. However, thinking about it in terms of the full name, i.e. Dan Sullivan and not Dan and Sullivan separately, it would presumably have one of the highest frequencies of any full name in Alaska, given that Daniel is in the top 15 and Sullivan is in the top 100. As for the Hafners, their presence on the ballot is more explainable. Both Eric and Carol are perennial candidates who have routinely generated media attention for running for office in states they don't live in, such as Hawaii, Oregon, and Wyoming, in addition to previous runs in Alaska. This is all permitted under the Constitution's requirement that a representative live in the state they plan to represent when elected, not necessarily while campaigning. When people think of political dynasties, their minds go to the Bushes, the Clintons, the Kennedys, families who seem to have been in politics forever. But those national dynasties pale in comparison to the staying power of Alaska's first families: the Begiches, the Murkowskis, and the Youngs. With the exception of a few months, in 1972 and 1973, at least one Begich, Murkowski, or Young has held office in Alaska since 1962 up until now. And the streak doesn't look poised to end soon. Of Alaska's 3 representatives in Congress, 2 are from the Big Three families, Senator Lisa Murkowski and Representative Nick Begich III. The Begich dynasty has been the most prolific of the 3 families. 4 Begiches have held elected office in Alaska. Nick Begich Sr. served in the Alaska State Senate and briefly was Alaska's lone representative in the U.S. House. His son Mark was the mayor of Anchorage and a U.S. senator, and his other son Tom was the minority leader of the Alaska State Senate. Nick III currently holds the same congressional seat once occupied by Nick Sr. Only 2 Murkowskis have gone into politics, Frank and his daughter Lisa, but the 2 of them have held down one of Alaska's U.S. Senate seats since 1981. Frank was also a one-term governor, while Lisa was a member of the Alaska House before entering the U.S. Senate. The only Young in Alaska politics was Don Young, but his resume sounds like it could be a combination of 3 different people. 6 years in the Alaska State Legislature and an astounding 49 years as Alaska's representative in the U.S. House, which led some to call him Alaska's 3rd senator. But why have so many dynasties taken root in Alaska? The success of the Begiches might be best explained by Alaska's population distribution. The Begiches are from Anchorage, where nearly a third of all Alaskans reside. As such, it stands to reason that a family popular in Anchorage's local environment would have success transferring their popularity statewide. The Murkowskis and Young may owe their success to a different quirk of Alaska politics. Both are from rural areas, outside the intuitive center of political power in the state. The Murkowskis are settled in the small town of Ketchikan, and Young lived in the even smaller village of Fort Yukon. Though it would seem difficult for those outside Anchorage to break into the upper echelon of Alaska politics, Alaska has a tradition of its rural constituencies uniting to exert profound influence over state political dealings. While Lisa Murkowski and Young were never members of this party-fluid Bush caucus, its presence has given considerable political sway to office holders in rural Alaska for decades, many of whom are tightly connected to their communities and thus likely to hold their seats, their potential stepping stone to higher office, until they choose to relinquish it. When the same names keep appearing on the ballot in Alaska in more ways than one, it presents a question. Why does this happen so much specifically in Alaska? Without a true scientific study, it's hard to know for sure, but my hypothesis is that it is reflective of the way politics work in rural America. Smaller, community-oriented places simply have less options, and are bound to be drawn to familiar faces, or in this case, familiar names. Not only is this borne out by Alaska's result and their 2026 ballot, but also by previous videos I've done on Kansas, where voters have elected senators from the same party for nearly a century, and Vermont, where the incumbent governor has held office for a decade and routinely earns more than 2/3 of the vote. But this dynamic in rural politics brings up an impossible ethical and intellectual dilemma, one that I'll leave as food for thought. When a select few hoard all of a region's political capital, is the people's choice to continue electing them really a choice at all?